Okay, we are going to start. We are going to start on page 34. It's Perek Zion in Noach. It's roughly, well, we'll start roughly Shlishi. We left off with Noach entering the Teva because of the floodwater, and we had discussed that the rabbis consider that an act of lack of faith, and the simple idea being lack of faith that would the Mabul really come, and only when the water came, Noach went on the boat. But it seems more likely to understand that it meant a lack of faith that Hashem would actually bring the Mabul, and that again, that faith in Hashem's goodness is sometimes a major undoing. All right, the Mabul comes, the water is there, 40 days, 40 nights of rain, which we discussed. Now, after the rain stops, the pasuk Yud Tes, verse 19 says, the Maim Gavru Mod al Aretz ve'yakusu kol harim hagavoim eshetachas kol hashemayim. Like we said, that the rain, it came down for 40 days and 40 nights, and then it like swelled. Even after the rain had actually stopped, the water swelled and just kept on rising. There was discussion of underground springs that had opened up, and it caused the water level to raise 15 amos above the highest mountains, which we discussed was to make sure that all of the giants would be able to have nowhere to flee, nowhere to go, and they would all die. All right, now the exact casualty of the Mabul is interesting. In Pasuk Kaf Aleph, it says that all the flesh that creeps on the ground amongst the birds and the animals and the wild animals and all the creepy crawlers and all the men, they all expired. Everything kol asher nishmas ruach chayim bi'apa, anything that breathes, mikol asher becharava, that was on the dry land, mesu, died. So the sages learned two limitations in this verse. First of all, it's everything that breathes in the dry land, meaning the fish were spared from the Mabul. We mentioned that according to the sages, the water was burning hot, which should have done the fish in, but the fish were taken to an area that it was not burning hot, and the fish survived. The conventional understanding is the fish were not negatively affected by mankind's evil acts, being separated from man, on being under the water. They don't live amongst man. The fish are, so to speak, covered. They're separate from mankind, and they did not involve in any, they were not negatively affected, and therefore they did not need to be wiped out. And the other thing that the certain sages say, and it seems to be the conventional approach, is that vegetation was not destroyed. You have the statement that everything that breathes is destroyed on the dry land, to the exclusion of the fish. And then it almost is repeated in the next pasuk, Vayimach es kol hayikum, everything that stood was erased, blotted out. Asher al pnei adama, that was on the land, may adam vad behema, from man to animal, remes, creeping crawler, like insect, of hashemayim, bird, vayimachu mina aretz, they were erased from the land, vayishar ach Noach, and you only had Noach, vasher ito bateva. But conspicuously missing is vegetation. If you contrast this to the destruction of Sodom and Amorah, the city of Sodom, so it's interesting because if you look, and hopefully we can find this faster than slow, it's going to be on page 88. So on page 88, it is going to say, on page 88, if you look at Pasuk Kaf Daled, it says Hashem rained on Sodom and Amorah gafris va'esh, fire and brimstone. Why use anything more than that standard translation? From God, from the heaven. The cities were overturned, and the entire plain, V'yaskol yoshvei ha'arim, all that lived in the cities, V'tzemach ha'adama, and the growth of the ground. Now that's conspicuously missing in the Mabul. It seems to be that when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, the nature of their destruction was such that it became an uninhabitable area, like we have now, the Dead Sea area. It's a wasteland. The Mabul was a destruction of human life and the animals that either were affected by the humans or were there to serve the humans, but it was not a destruction of the inhabitable world. The world was just covered with water. Now, obviously, there is an element of miracle here. Right. So this will get to where we discuss our miut hanes. Certainly, it would be more miraculous for a person to live the sum total that the earth was underwater was basically a calendar year. So to have a calendar year with a human or an animal underwater would be a far greater miracle in that they are breathing creatures, whereas we do know that there is plant life underwater. Now, no one is going to suggest that normal plant life is going to survive underwater or for a year, especially because there wasn't sun really coming through, as we will see. Nevertheless, the nature of that miracle is clearly less so because the plant can go dormant and it sits down. It does not mean that the flowers were flourishing. It was desolation, but it would be like the sages explain, it would be like wintertime, where you just have the things that are in the ground stay in the ground. They go dormant in the ground, and the trees stay, but they just don't blossom. And the biggest proof to this approach, of course, is the dove, because the dove comes back with a olive branch, which would imply that the trees were going, and it says that there was a leaf on that branch. So the idea is that right away, from the moment the water stopped,
right away,
okay, within days or what is that? The tree didn't come back. Within a short period of time, the trees were going again. And this also makes it more understandable how besides the fact that otherwise you'd have to ask the question of how did the entire agricultural world jumpstart itself? We don't see Noach per se carrying species of all types of plant life, but more importantly is the Torah is pretty clear, although it doesn't say it explicitly, it says it by way of what it doesn't say. It says everything that breathed died, and it doesn't say the plant life died. We have the plant life being there when the dove comes to take, the tree branch. We do see the contrast that by Sodom, where the plant life was destroyed, it specifies that it was destroyed. And this would simply explain how everyone was able to get on with their lives immediately upon coming off the teva, the animals, because again, everything. And again, there is an element of miracle involved, clearly. But
water.
Right, that's a big difference because fire destroys, water destroys too, but it's clearer how water destroys that which breathes, right? And therefore the fish also surviving is not nearly the same type of miracle, although there was a miraculous nature because the sages understand that the water was hot. But if you take the simple reading of the Chumash, the fish surviving is self-evident. There's no reason for them not to survive. That it's just
Was Gan-Eden affected?
What?
Was Gan-Eden?
That's a fascinating idea because the sages have a debate where the branch that the dove took from, because some are of the opinion that although the trees weren't destroyed, but clearly we know from wintertime it takes time for trees to bud, and so they actually understand that the dove went to Gan Eden to pull that leaf off. It's a difficult thing to explain because conventionally we understand that Gan Eden at this point is off Earth, it's not on Earth. So clearly there's some either allegorical or metaphysical concept in which the dove went to get something from Gan Eden. But it's fascinating you asked that, because the sages talk in those terms, although it's generally understood not to be literal, because we generally understand that although Gan Eden was a physical place on Earth, and the commentators discuss it as if it is a physical place on Earth, and it will certainly be a physical place on Earth once again, it is less than clear that it is currently a physical place on Earth, and currently today would mean by the Mabul also. Yeah.
How did the birds die if they could fly over the water?
So the assumption would be that other than the medrash, which you had heat and steam coming up, I don't think a bird can fly without landing for that long a period of time, which means that eventually the birds would have flown higher and higher and then run out of energy and plop down into the water.
Oh.
I mean, effectively, they would have had to fly. They could have kept on going to the highest mountain. Now, to get rid of the birds, though, you would not have needed to cover the mountains 15 amos. You could have covered the mountains by, a couple of inches or feet tops. This assuming, of course, that birds could fly at such altitudes. I'm certainly not, what's the official term, an ornithologist or something like that, or right? I'm certainly not a bird expert, but my guess is that birds that fly at a certain altitude, there comes to be a certain point where if the air is too light, they don't fly properly or whatever. So, but even if they could not fly for a year straight. There was no food. There would have been no food for them, and they died, except the ones that were on the boat. Okay, so basically, you're going to have a.
The waters were continuing to diminish until the 10th month.
Right. So okay.
It wasn't like right away that they left.
Right. Correct. So I'm saying so by the right. So that but it's not that much time between the time that the water subsided and they went. Okay. Fine. Now, we now have a picture again that all animal life has been wiped out except that which is on the boat. Vegetation is dormant or in its ungrowthed form, but the trees are physically there, right? The world's ready to get going once again, but the water is going. Now, the last pasuk in Zion is Vayigbru Amayim al Arts Chamishim Me'as Yom. That's what I was mentioning before, that although the rain only fell for 40 days, there was actually 150 days, roughly half a year almost, of the water getting higher and higher to the point that it reached its maximum height. And then chapter 8, Hashem remembers Noah, which every time we say Hashem remembers, it's not to be understood in the term of that he had forgotten, because that's nonsense. It means to us, it seems that he began to pay attention to, and he is now going to begin the process of the water diminishing. So the first thing is the underground ma'ayonos tahom, the underground fountains get shut off, except for the ones the world needs. So those springs that still exist, those were left open, but most of the springs were closed off. The implication being that there is a tremendous amount of subterranean water that is in the earth that could come out, but is contained. And then the arubas shamayim, the windows of heaven, meaning the rain, it gets, shut off. And then slowly but surely, there begins a gradual process of the water receding, being absorbed back into the ground. And it comes out that at the end of the 150-day period and starts swelling, then the water starts going down, and finally the boat in the 7th month, and there's a whole discussion, and there's a nice chart, I believe, on one of these pages that discuss, it might be in the back. All right, there's a whole discussion on the exact timeline of the flood. The two big issues in the timeline is everything's referred to by, let's say in Pasuk Daled, the 7th month. So the question is the 7th month from when? We count months from Nisan, because that's when the Exodus took place. The world was created, according to some, in Tishrei. This is prior to the Exodus, chronologically, historically, but it's being given to us, readers, post the Exodus at Har Sinai. So it's unclear if the 7th month here is the 7th month from Nisan, or is it the 7th month from Tishrei? And then even throwing out everything to do with the Exodus, there's even a dispute on what is the first month of the year period. So there's a general question if the 7th month here is from Tishrei, the 7th month, or the 7th month from Nisan. And then there's another question, is it the 7th month from when the water began to fall, 7th month from the beginning of the year? And then there's Rashi goes through and the other portion go through various different calculations, how and you can pinpoint on what date each thing happens. The one thing everyone seems to agree with is that it took 1 calendar year. So the whole process from rain starting to Noah getting off the boat was a year. It was a solar year, and it was a 365-day unit. But exactly when everything happened within that year is subject to a whole bunch of disputes, and therefore I'm not that interested in getting through the calculation.
The calendar for the world was Tishrei.
Right. So
the calendar for the Jewish people
right, but
was Nisan.
even that point's disputed. Some say that everything is from Nisan, even the world. So that throws all these things into debate. So we'll leave it at that. It's important, but not in the setting. So
Let me ask one question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we said that everything that
Breathed, yes.
okay, was wiped out, except for
What's on there? Yeah.
So it mentions Noah to this and to each time, all of that. Now, the two things that were created when the world was started was the Leviathan, which wasn't touched because of the sea. Okay.
Okay, fine,
Fish.
fine.
Okay. What about Shiur HaTorah?
So the Gemara discusses a different animal, which is the Karnei Re'im, which is an even larger animal. And it discusses how it was similar to Og. It was strapped because it's too big for the ark.
Right.
So it was strapped on to the end and tied to the side. So if there was such a need, that's what would it be for that as well. But the Gemara doesn't talk about it in terms of that animal, to my recollection, but it's in a different gigantic animal that the Gemara is bothered by that very question. Now it's funny because I like this is actually it's a great concept. The Gemara gives astronomical dimensions to what's called the Karnei Re'im, a gigantic animal, similar to this. Now, most commentators will understand that the dimensions given are so astronomically large that they can't be taken literal, meaning it just can't be that big. It's too big. Mm-hmm. So they understand that it means something. Nevertheless, the Talmud asks, how could such a animal fit on the boat? Now, the commentators ask on themselves, well, what kind of question is that? If it's an allegorical size, so how do you ask a question, how does an allegorically sized creature fit on a boat? Because what's the question? So it's a great answer.
And the boat only took pairs.
Right. Okay. So that's well. Okay. That's something else. Yeah. So the answer is a fantastic answer, which is the boat also held more than its dimensions. This works better with the Ramban, like we said last week. So the boat's dimensions also are allegorical. Now, it doesn't mean that there wasn't a boat with that dimension. That's literal. But the dimensions themselves contained an allegorical number in the sense that they contain much greater than their actual size, which means to say the size given is not the actual capacity of the boat. It's what we refer to the capacity of the boat, but the boat really can hold much more, right? I mean, right, the boat has dimensions that are real, but we know that really they hold greater than those dimensions. So the question is, in the number used by the sages to hold this, for this gigantic creature, well, then the number the Torah uses for
Rabbi, you're muted. Yeah. Just click the little microphone icon underneath.
this. Am I not muted now?
There you go. There you go.
Yeah. All right. So again, the numbers used by the sages to describe the creature have to work within the numbers used by the Torah, meaning it's all based on the same system of numbers. So in as much as the Torah's numbers are specific numbers that really held a greater amount, so the animal's numbers are numbers the sages used that are really greater than its actual size, but those numbers have to work with those numbers, and that's the nature of the question, which to me, what I understand is that the Gemara will ask questions sometimes we will get so, because we're so concrete and so narrow-minded, we'll get so fixed in the act. They're asking, the whole thing is on a different plane. It's the boat's dimensions as we're given versus the sage's numbers, and the boat's dimensions are not what it really held, and the sage's numbers are not its real size. But everyone chose, Hashem chose the numbers for a reason. They wanted the boat to be a certain size, and the sages used the numbers to represent something. So in the system of the sages and the Torah, one's too big for the other, right? So that's it. But it takes analysis of the discussions, specifically the non-halachic discussions, because those are far more concrete because we have to act based on that. But the more philosophical or the more explanatory type discussions in the Talmud, many times the entire discussion is being held in a different spectrum of reality, so to speak. Both the questions, so that's what is coming out from there. But the long and short of your question is, yes, the animals that were unusually large, whether it be a boar or the sages deal with them in their largeness as it compares to the dimensions given by the Torah of the ark, and then come up with solutions. I believe that they had the head on the deck tied up and the body was swinging in the ground. I think that's what they say. Yeah.
So if the dimensions of the teva don't really, are allegorical, what was the point of recording them?
No, that's exactly the point. They are specifically those numbers for a reason. And they were those numbers. If you would have taken a ruler and but they held much greater than that. So the numbers were not limiting to the reality is they contained a much greater, again, this is really within the Rambans, which is the more accepted approach than the Ran's quasi-evolutionary approach. The idea is that the boat really had much greater area. That being said, it actually, when you measured it, it was that area. So then the question becomes, what's the point of having those numbers if it held bigger? No, because those numbers there is an importance to those numbers, just that the importance does not lie in its physical capacity. The importance is in a different realm.
that thing she takes out of the bag, these things are coming out. Is that, even though the bag is this big, I'm just like.
Right, no, but the same idea, it's the same idea. So there are dimensions, and the dimensions are real. If you take a ruler, that's what they were. But in so much as they didn't hold that amount, clearly the dimensions have meaning in a different realm, because again, just to record the physical dimensions, I mean, it would be a nice historical fact, but
Hey, the physical dimensions, length and width and height are finite.
right.
Volume is not, that's just a conception.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? You could take you could take this pushner.
It's only gonna hold so much,
It can only hold so much.
right?
But if you have a boat and the walls are either thin or you rearrange things, you can go by, you can have it.
When everything's said and done, the volume is limited to whatever the length times width times height is, once you figure out what the length times width times height is. Whether it be thin, there is a number. Okay, that's true. Okay, so now you're talking about a different thing. So animals can't be compressed in a normal realm, but here it's a miraculous realm. Good, but so now where do the numbers come in? So the numbers are the actual physical dimensions, although they didn't serve the physical purpose, thereby lending to the idea that these numbers represent something. Whatever they represent, when compared to the size of the animal that the sages use, which represent something, well, they're too big for what this represents. That's the level of question. So the Talmud is dealing on a question answer on a totally different plane than what we would call the simple reality. They're dealing on a much greater reality. Correct. The same concept where you had dimensions that held more space than the dimensions allowed for, but still the dimensions have meaning, and they're actually there. Okay. That's one of those things that I knew. That's one of those things that if I knew, I couldn't tell. But since I don't really know, I can tell you that I don't know. But
we can't see those dimensions.
well, I mean, we could build a boat with those numbers, but right, but we wouldn't. You would need to know deeper what the dimensions represent. You'd have, and specifically in conjunction with the size of the animal. That's beyond what I can share with you. If I did know, I wouldn't be able to tell you. And
dimensions represent the size of the table in comparison to a house or something.
Okay, whatever it is, but the point is that those numbers have a meaning, and they're not big enough for the sages' numbers. That's the question. Okay, the boat goes down. It eventually hits the mountain of Ararat, a mountain that is generally understood to be the same name in Turkey of Ararat. Geographically, it does fit with the being that part of the world. Ararat happens to be a very tall mountain. It is certainly not the tallest mountain in the world. Those are in Nepal, which is, I mean, relatively close to here compared to America, but not actually close geographically. I mean, there's a good distance away. There's nothing that implies how Ararat was the highest mountain. The boat had to be somewhere, wherever the boat was going to land. Eventually, it would hit a mountain in the spot that it was. It does work to be Turkey primarily because of I'll say well known because I know it, but there's a general understood medrash that when Haman was looking for a 50 cubit piece of wood to hang Mordechai on, it's not easy to find wood that big. So he sent a delegation up to Arad. They pulled one of the boards off of the teva that had sunk into and used that as the pillar. Now, Turkey is relatively close to what would be northern Iraq, which is where Persia would be. That is a close dimensional comparison, which does put it does give credence to the idea that the area is the same. Also, the working assumption is that there's no Ararat in in, like New Mexico or whatever. So if there's internet in Turkey, probably there's a reason they called it that, and the Torah is calling it that, as much as, you could say anything. So that is the generally understood approach, and I have no problem with that. You have no shortage of expeditions that were made in that region that claim to have found pieces of the ark. I suppose it's all possible. I can't tell you, but there's no shortage of Discovery Channel documentaries of the like. Okay, the one thing you do have, which is undisputable, is the flood story does transcend all cultures, all, I guess with a lowercase a, but most cultures, which it should, since it did affect all mankind. And you do find all kinds of creatures, both aquatic and land, on all high, low places in all different parts of the world. And although the fish did not die, that does not mean that fish didn't die when the water receded and some of the fish were left on land where there shouldn't have been land. Those fish may have died because they were taken to a place. Meaning, fish as a species were not wiped out by the flood, but fish certainly died. I mean, fish die anyways because fish died. So if the water happened to be where the water shouldn't be, and a fish died at that point, it would have sunk in. So those are the two undisputable facts that are, fascinating to contemplate. But there are fossils of marine and land creatures in places that they should not be. Scientists have their fun times explaining why that is. It usually involves some sort of, environmental catastrophe, whether it be a volcano, an ice age, or this and that. It's something happened. We would explain it more simply that there was a worldwide flood, and that's what they're there. And again, you do have the common story, although the details are slightly different, but the basic gist of there being a flood is a universal in most cultures.
So when we had the model, it was only in one area of the world at the time. There's no
All right. So okay. So
he didn't go to Australia. They took.
So we're gonna. There's two things here. There is a school of thought that the flood was limited to the area in which there was human habitation, which would not be the entire world, because there was no need to flood the rest of the world. That is not the conventional understanding. The conventional understanding is it was the entire globe. Certainly with our understanding that when creation started, it was following a previous model. If you're going to use that idea, it certainly was a worldwide thing. That is definitely the way it's generally understood, although there are those who do understand it was localized to where human beings were, but that's generally not how we explain that. The fossils of the animals are all over the world, so that wouldn't work nicely either. The Australia element is going to be explained soon when the nations get split up. We are going to explain that the world looked vastly different before that event and after that event. And the world during the flood looks very different than the world does today. So that we will get to that. The short answer is there was no Australian island during the flood. It had not yet separated from the Asian mainland, but we'll get there. And although the scientists will agree that Australia did separate from the Asian mainland, they'll believe that it happened a gazillion years ago. We're going to put the date at roughly just in the lifetime of Abraham, so about 3,300, no, that's too early, 3,700 years ago. But that we'll discuss later. All right, so now it's time to get off the boat. Not going to dwell too much on this, but you have the famous story: the raven was sent, the raven didn't go. The dove was sent. The dove at first, went, came back, finally went, brought a tree, and then finally went and settled. And the third aliyah ends with the flood water receding totally. The ground is dry. The dove doesn't come back. And then verse 13, Yud Gimel says, in the 601st year, on the first of the month, the water had dried. Noach is able to take the cover off the teva. Then they see the land had dried. And by the second month, in the 27th day, the earth was totally dry and inhabitable. The flood started on the 17th day of the second month. It ended in the sense that mankind walked on the earth again on the 27th day of the second month. So that's either going to be Cheshvan to Cheshvan or Iyar to Iyar. And 17 days of the month to 27 days of the month represents the 10 days that the lunar year is shy of the solar year. The lunar year is 354 and a fraction. The solar year is 365 and a fraction. So that 10-11 day difference, that's going to be the difference between starting on the 17th day and ending on the 27th. And the idea is that the flood took a solar calendar year. Okay, now Noah gets off the boat with his family, takes all the animals. He commands the animals to to populate, and the animals, they duplicate and multiply at basically a miraculous rate because they need to repopulate things. And they all go to where they need to go. And according to the Ran, they actually change as they go to where they need to go. According to the Ramban, they would have been in the wrong place. They just would have had to have a little bit of miraculous help getting back to where they belong. And the world is repopulated animal-wise. You have Noah, his children, his wife, they come off, and now they start, they're going to start having children, and they're going to also try to repopulate the world. The very first thing the Torah records that Noah does is he builds a mizbeach, and he takes all the kosher animals and birds, and he brings olos. Olos are korbanos that are totally burnt. This would be the expression that Cain and Hevel had done in the Torah. According to the sages, Adam had done the same thing on the day he was created. This would be very similar to our discussion we had before of man being overwhelmed with such a feeling of thanks to God. I mean, if you can only imagine what it is to walk off the boat knowing that, I mean, there's so many movies that are like this, where there's a catastrophe and you're the only one left, and you get off, like that first scene where you realize you were spared and everyone else is gone. So Noah is absolutely overwhelmed with a sense of gratitude because he sees the